because I'm sure we do have questions out there, but I want to jump now to Sara Hamilton. I want to say that Sara this is a repeat for her. She gave a talk on Oregon's kelp forest status and trends at our 2018 symposium. And then last year, she took a break from kelp and talked about pycnopodia, what was going on in the world of those sunflower sea stars that we saw in Lindley's images, the ones that predate on urchins that were so devastated by a disease. But she's back this year to talk about her work on kelp and bring us up to date on what she knows and what we might expect in the world of understanding our kelp resources. She was a contributor to the feasibility study, providing some of her work to Tim and the feasibility study team, and I want to thank her for that. That was really good stuff. And appreciate your effort and your interest, Sara. So it's all yours. Thanks. You are muted, Sara.
Yes. Thank you.
Take two.
Okay, I was just getting set up anyway, so this works out perfect. Okay, hi everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm really excited to talk to this group today. This is my second or third time speaking for the Elakha Alliance, and I always really enjoy it. So thanks again for inviting me back. As Bob mentioned, my name is Sara Hamilton, and I'm finishing up my PhD at Oregon State University. And my thesis is focused on using a variety of tools and approaches to better understand how kelp forests in the Pacific Northwest are responding to global change. So today I'll be kind of bringing together a bunch of different things that I've learned during my PhD to give you all some insight into the nature and the state of our kelp forests here in Oregon, since otters are often tied to kelp forests. But before I launch in, I'd like to stop for a moment to acknowledge that I live on the traditional homelands of the Chimpinifa band of the Kalapuya peoples, who were forcibly removed from the land in the mid-1800s. Their living descendants today include members of the confederated tribes of both the Grand Ronde community of Oregon and of the Siletz Indians. So to dive in, first off, let's briefly define what a kelp is. Most people don't know. So kelps are large brown marine seaweeds. They photosynthesize the way that plants do. They live in cool, shallow waters, and they actually line about a quarter of the world's coastlines. So they're actually pretty ubiquitous. So why exactly do we care about these large brown seaweeds? Well, it's important. Kelps are important because kelps are ecosystem engineers, which I refer to as the if you build it, they will come species. Because an ecosystem engineer is an organism that creates, modifies, or maintains habitat for other critters. So a classic example would be the way that trees create homes for birds, insects, etc. Just like trees create forests, kelps create ecosystems just by being there. So more specifically, what kinds of benefits do kelp forests provide for the ecosystem and for us? Well, as ecosystem engineers, they provide habitat for all sorts of critters, like fish, abalone, mysids, otters, and more. Kelp itself is also eaten by many critters directly. In this picture, you see some pegula snails that are munching on this type of the kelp, but urchins, abalone, some kinds of fish, amphipods, and many other critters directly consume kelp's rich tissues. Even outside of the kelp forest itself, kelp can provide nutrients and substance. When kelp is dislodged by big waves, which happens a lot, the nutrient-rich kelp tissues can drift away and accumulate on the beach or in the deep sea or other places, where they can provide nutrients and food for critters that are hundreds of miles away from the kelp forest itself.
Hey, Sara,
Yes.
you may want to try turning off your personal video. Your audio is kind of choppy around the edges, and that may help give you some more bandwidth.
Okie doke. Thanks for that heads up, Bob. Let me know if it continues to be choppy. Maybe I will grab a pair of headphones real quickly and see if that helps. Let's see. Bob, can you hear me all right?
Sounds better now. That definitely sounds better.
Okay, great. Okay, where was I? Okay, so kelp forests are also key to a number of commercially important fisheries. For example, kelp can be a nursery habitat for rockfish and salmon. And a nursery habitat is one that's particularly important to juveniles. Juvenile salmon and rockfish have been shown to really like using kelp to hide in from predators. Kelp forests also support urchins, abalone, and other commercially prized species. Additionally, kelp is also frequently used as sites of recreation and tourism, from snorkeling to kayaking to spearfishing. That's actually a picture of my partner snorkeling here in Oregon in a kelp forest with me. And then finally, scientists think that kelp can help pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So kelps are really prolific photosynthesizers, and it's likely that all that carbon that they suck down out of the atmosphere during photosynthesis, it's likely that some of that carbon is getting buried in the deep sea and being stored away from the atmosphere, kind of similar to how the Amazon rainforest sequesters carbon in its trees and soil. And so when you add it all up, a recent study done by the firm Earth Economics found that kelp forests were worth about $260 million a year to the California economy. So we don't have numbers for Oregon, but that just gives you a bit of a number of how these ecosystem services, as we would call them, translate into coastal economies and coastal dollars. So why do I care about kelp, and why have I spent 5 years of my life studying it? Because of all the benefits that it provides to ecosystems and to people. So what's the problem? Why are we worried about kelp nowadays? Well, kelp are facing a lot of threats that are caused by industrialized human societies. In fact, we're seeing major declines in kelp cover all over the world. We've seen major collapses of kelp ecosystems in Australia, the Gulf of Maine, Spain, just to name a few. Why are we losing these unique ecosystems? Well, some of the top threats involve ocean warming, because kelps are fundamentally cool water species. So marine warming and heat waves associated with climate change are really tough on them. Additionally, coastal runoff and pollution, invasive species, and urchin overgrazing are other threats that have contributed to collapses of kelp forests worldwide. Furthermore, we actually have an example of this happening strikingly close to home. In 2015, the bull kelp forests in Northern California collapsed due to several interacting stressors and lost about 90% of their bull kelp area. And thus far, those forests really haven't started coming back in any meaningful way. So that kind of leads to the obvious question, which is, oh shoot, what's happening here in Oregon with our kelp forests? So let's start by orienting ourselves to the kelp forest landscape here in Oregon. First off, let's talk about species. Now, as far as big kelps that reach the surface of the ocean and create forests, the most famous kelp is the giant kelp, pictured here. If you've ever seen scenes of kelp forests in nature documentaries, giant kelps are probably the ones you saw in those documentaries. However, we really don't have much giant kelp here in Oregon. Instead, we primarily have bull kelp. And bull kelp is an annual species that only lives for about a year, and it's much less understood than giant kelp. It's much less studied. One note is that I'm talking about giant kelp and bull kelp specifically, but there are many other species of kelp here in Oregon. They just tend to be smaller and they don't provide as much habitat as canopy forming kelps. Now, these big, beautiful bull kelp forests are found primarily in the southern third of the state. The biggest forests that you'll find in Oregon are around Cape Arago, Port Orford, Gold Beach, and then kind of scattered along the south coast down towards California. You can certainly find bull kelp in central and northern Oregon, but probably about 90% of the population is in the southern third of the state. So that's where our kelp is. Now let's talk about what kind of threats kelp face here in Oregon. A list of probable stressors, and I say probable because there hasn't been very much research done on kelp here in Oregon. A list of probable stressors impacting our kelp include a variety of aspects of climate change, including warming waters, stormier waters, and changing ocean circulation patterns. Additionally, between the extirpation of otters more than 100 years ago and the loss of sunflower sea stars in 2015, Oregon no longer has any major urchin predators, which means that urchin populations aren't being held in check anymore. And then finally, it's possible that pollution or runoff from Oregon cities or rivers could be impacting our kelps here as well. No one's really looked into that here, but I think it's worth keeping in mind. And just to note, all these different stressors, they don't act in isolation. They can combine with one another to have synergistic impacts on kelp to make things that much harder for kelp to get by. So we really do have to think about the whole picture and not just about a single threat. And these probable stressors appear to be having a real impact on Oregon's kelp forests. Here you can see a time series of total bull kelp cover across Oregon from 1984 to 2020. Across the bottom, you have the year starting in 1984. And over on the left, I'm showing you the total area of bull kelp across the state. You can see that since 1984, we indeed have seen a real decline in the amount of bull kelp here in Oregon. We're no longer getting some of those huge bonanza years for kelp that we used to see. This graph looks at the whole state of Oregon. Let's zoom in a little bit and talk about where in Oregon some of these losses are occurring. So these are the same graphs that I showed you in the previous slide. They're just for individual reefs instead of for the entire state. And when you dig into the data and look at kelp populations in individual areas, you find really variable trends. So here at the top, you can see that kelp cover at Cape Girardeau has actually stayed pretty steady since the 1980s, whereas cover at Warford Reef and Redfish Rocks has really dropped. But in the last 10 years at Rogue Reef down in Gold Beach, kelp cover has only been expanding. So what does that mean? What are these all these variable trends mean? Well, it suggests that since kelp isn't decreasing evenly across the state, this indicates that local conditions that can be different at each reef are influencing the health of kelp forests locally. So what might be some of those local factors? Well, there certainly could be local scale differences in sources of pollution or runoff. There can also be local scale differences in environmental conditions like water temperature or water chemistry. We don't know much about those potential stressors or impacts, though. One thing that we do know about, and we do know is impacting at least some of these reefs, are urchins. So some reefs, but not all of them, we're seeing really troubling numbers of urchins coming out to graze down kelp. For example, a recent study by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife found a 10,000% increase in purple sea urchins over the past 5 years. Growth study recorded 350 million purple sea urchins living near Port Orford, Oregon since 2014. Over here on the right, you can see some pictures I've taken of some of the urchin barrens in some of our kelp forests here in Oregon. And literally the urchins can be packed in so tight that they are just spine to spine. There is no room between them. Now let me make just one note about the urchin problem. Urchins are the most obvious problem that we've talked about. It's really easy to go out and see that there are a bunch of urchins and it's a problem. But it's likely not the only stressor for our kelp forest here in Oregon. If we removed all of these urchins, our kelp forest might still be declining due to climate change, pollution, or other impacts. However, I kind of think of urchins as a kind of almost pre-existing condition. A kelp forest that's battered or destroyed by a million hungry urchins, it's going to have a much harder time adapting to climate change. So if we can help get the urchin populations under control, then we remove a pre-existing condition for our kelp forests and give our patient a better chance of surviving. Given that we see that kelp cover is declining across Oregon and that we are seeing some really troubling levels of urchins at some of these reefs, what are some of our options for preserving kelp forests? So first off, as I mentioned before, I'd like to just point out again that there's really been very little research in Oregon on our kelp forests. And this stymies our ability to figure out how to help them recover. More research is really desperately needed to help us come up with what would be the best restoration strategies here in Oregon. However, given the information that we do have, some things that we could start doing could include doing targeted urchin removals at affected reefs, helping to recover sunflower sea star populations here in Oregon, reintroducing sea otters and hoping that they target urchin populations, or kelp seeding work, which is basically boosting the number of baby kelps that are out there. And then there are many other ideas for restoration and recovery of kelp forests that people are trying worldwide. Really, I'd say the US and Oregon in particular is kind of behind the times in terms of actively managing and supporting our kelp forests, or at least behind efforts that are going on in Japan and Tasmania. So I'd be pumped to see this kind of work going on here in Oregon. So I want to just take a moment to acknowledge one such effort. The Oregon Kelp Alliance is a recently formed group that focuses on community-based restoration of kelp forests here in Oregon. This summer, the group, which I'm a part of, piloted an urchin removal experiment at Nelly's Cove in Port Orford. Using more than 30 volunteer divers, the group cleared about 47,000 individual urchins from an area the size of about 2/3 of a football field. We did before and after surveys of the cove. So we're hoping that next summer we'll be able to take stock of whether this urchin clearing experiment actually led to new recruitment for kelp. So I would suggest people Google the Oregon Kelp Alliance and check out their website, because the group's hoping to expand to sites outside of Port Orford. And I think that this is the kind of thoughtful stewardship of our kelp forests that is going to be really critical to preserving them here in Oregon. So I'm really enjoyed being part of this group and honored to kind of share some of this with y'all. So finally, I'd just like to say a few words about looking to the future of kelp forests on planet Earth. Sometimes I feel bad about telling people that kelp forests here in Oregon are declining, because I know that it's difficult to hear day in and day out bad news about the environment. That it's scary and upsetting, certainly for me at least. I'd like to end by talking about some of the really exciting things that I see in the future for kelp forests. First, let's talk a little bit about the idea of adaptive capacity and the potential for adaptive capacity in kelps. What is adaptive capacity? Basically, it's the ability for species to develop new traits or tolerances that allow them to persist and thrive in new environments, aka will allow them to thrive under climate change. And adaptive capacity is really tightly tied to a critter's generation time, or how long it lives. So things like bacteria and viruses are able to adapt really quickly to new environmental conditions, because they just reproduce so quickly and they have short lifespans, meaning that the species can quickly build up new traits, just like the way COVID had evolved the Delta variant. Kelp, unlike critters like elephants or cold water corals or a lot of other animal critters that we care about, live just a few years. In fact, one of the primary species here in Oregon, bull kelp, you heard me mention, it only lives a single year. So that actually really ups the capacity of kelp species to rapidly develop new traits, for instance, like heat tolerance, that could be important with climate change. Scientists are trying to use this information to identify lines of kelp that are heat resistant to use in recovery and restoration. And so that makes kelps, I think, just a little more likely to be able to weather climate change compared to other critters that we care about a lot. So that's a bright spot to keep your eyes on. Two, I personally just think it's really exciting, because I feel like we're really at the beginning of learning about how to actively restore kelps and kelp forests. A lot of people around the world, scientists and non-scientists, are saying, hey, we're not okay with losing our kelp forest. What can we do about this? What can we do to keep it here? And I think it's a whole new horizon for kelp forest ecology, and a pretty exciting time to be a kelp scientist because of this new focus on restoration. Like, a lot of new ideas are coming out, new experiments going on. People are experimenting with new techniques like green gravel, outplanting kelps, urchin removal strategies, developing heat tolerant kelps, and a lot more. And so I'm excited for the potential of these kinds of techniques, and to see how these new techniques develop. So I think that's another cool thing to keep your eyes on, something I'm personally excited for. And then finally, I think folks living in industrialized Western society are kind of beginning to see that when you let Indigenous people co-manage and lead in the management of our natural resources, you end up having better outcomes in terms of ecosystem health and sustainability. And I can certainly attest to this in the kelp forest sphere. But a lot of the innovative and meaningful work being done on kelp forests that I'm seeing and hearing about is being led or driven by Indigenous peoples, like initiating really innovative new monitoring programs or revising kelp harvest policies. I've really been particularly excited by a lot of the work going on with the coastal First Nations in British Columbia, for one specific example. And so I'm really hoping that we're going to see more regions letting Indigenous people lead in these spaces. And I think it's going to have positive outcomes for kelp specifically, but for ocean management in general. And so I'm really jazzed to see just how close or how deeply connected the Elakha Alliance and some of Oregon's tribes are on the sea otter issue. I think that's a good step in the right direction and one of these kind of bright spots to keep your eyes on. So I'm getting close to my time here, folks, and we've gone over a lot. So I'm just going to leave you with a few summary points. First is that kelp forests benefit us and benefit the ecosystems that we care about. Second, Oregon's kelp forests really aren't looking so good right now. We know that there are some serious declines going on in some parts of Oregon. Third, there are a lot of interacting threats. Urchins are one of the most visible of these threats, but there are many that are probably impacting and causing these impacting our forests and causing these declines. And then there certainly are steps that we can take to make our kelp forest stronger. And I would really encourage, all residents in Oregon to think about that and think about ways that they might be able to contribute or learn more about it. Speaking of learning more about it, first off, I'd just like to say thank you so much for listening. Thank you to the Elakha Alliance again for letting me come and toot my horn about how amazing kelp is. If you have questions about anything that you saw today, or you're interested, or you want resources, my name is there, and my email is hamilton@oregonstate.edu. Additionally, you can always find me on my Twitter. And I would just really welcome any communications from folks that might have questions or something like that. So again, thank you so much for your time. And I think we have about 10 minutes or so. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to go ahead and take it.
So Chanel, I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of the time we've got. And thank you so much, Sara. Tim asks a question. Says, Sara, can you address the recent situation in Northern California? It has left me a bit confused, as it seems to have suddenly and maybe inexplicably turned around in a few months, which speaks to them needing more research. Can you talk about what's going on in Northern California?
Yeah, totally. That is a really interesting situation. So a couple of thoughts that I have about that. Let me just I'm looking back over the question. So one thing to note is that Northern California's kelp forests are primarily bull kelp like ours. And bull kelp, as I mentioned, is an annual species. So when you have annual species, they only live for a year. So those species respond really quickly to changing environmental conditions. You kind of saw that, even 30 years ago in Oregon, there was a lot of bouncing around in how much kelp cover there was in Oregon. And we just know that kelp forests are really dynamic systems that can change very quickly. And so the collapse that happened in Northern California around 2015 is actually a great example of how quickly kelp forest systems can change. And so I guess my personal thoughts on or I guess I don't know as much about what the last few months have held for Northern California. I guess my two thoughts are one, it could basically be that we're just having a good year. Waters are cooler. There's something going on in the water that is good for bull kelp and bull kelp recruitment. And that's really in line with what we know about how variable they are. They can collapse really quickly, but sometimes they can come back in a big way very quickly as well. Additionally, my thought, and something I've heard from one or two people working in Northern California, is that some of the media coverage is a little overblown currently. There's a little bit of a like, oh, look, it's all back now, we're fine, which based on some conversations I've had with folks who work in Northern California, it's more like this is one good this is a little bit of good news, but it doesn't mean that the crisis is over. It doesn't mean these kelp forests are restored and the critters that rely on them are restored. So I think my guess is probably that we got some cool water or some other ocean conditions, this year that are good for kelp. And that's really a good sign. I'm happy to hear that. But I don't think our problems in Northern California are over. So I hope that provides a little bit of insight, Tim.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go ahead and ask just another quick question here, so we have a couple of minutes. Michelle wants to know, do we have any information regarding the historical distribution of canopy-forming kelps on the Oregon coast, and any indication that it might have been different from the concentration on the southern coast that we see today? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we do have this. This is a really interesting source of historical information on kelps, which is actually back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when the US government was first trying to make maps of the coastlines of the US. They would send boats out to do bathymetric surveys and map surveys, essentially to map out coastlines. And one of the funny things is that in measuring bathymetry, so how deep your boat, how deep the water your boat in is that boats can't go into really thick kelp beds. So you have these maps. I actually have one that hangs up over my office. These maps that show all these, map out this coastline and actually point out these big, beautiful kelp forests, specifically because they couldn't get their boats in there to tell you how deep that water is. And so that's something that's been used. These historical maps have actually been used in British Columbia to try to understand, 100 plus years ago, how, what did our kelp forests look like? So that's one source of information. The satellite surveys that I showed you went back to the 30s, although that doesn't help very much in terms of otters. And then finally, I think, I'm not sure what kind of traditional knowledge the tribes here in Oregon might have about that. I haven't been able to ask them, but it might be something that some of the tribes, that's certainly something that's been used for, say, British Columbia, is asking the tribes, where did you used to collect kelp, or where were the good fishing grounds or things like that, and kind of surmising where past kelp coverage used to be from that. However, in terms of where kelp was back when we still had otters in Oregon, there is pretty much nothing that I really know of, other than some very early patchy navigational surveys. I will say that I think kelp probably wasn't really in one thing limiting the distribution of kelp in northern and central Oregon is just the amount of rocky reef habitat that's at the right depth. And so there's a much less rocky reef habitat in shallow waters in northern Oregon, for example. So even if we had otters, kelp needs that rocky reef, not sandy bottoms. So that could be something that's, limiting where kelp is in Oregon, no matter the otters.
Similarly, I'm going to pitch for a webinar we have on December 1st with Josie Iselin. Sorry if I mispronounce your last name. But she has been researching all those old kelp maps. So she'll be presenting on the bull kelp journey of the Pacific coast. So if you're really interested in learning more about that and seeing those maps, I suggest you join us for another webinar on December 1st.
Yeah, that's going to be good. Josie does great work. She's producing some beautiful artwork around marine algae, but she's also doing this important work digging out these historical records that, as Sara was mentioning, mapped or charted the location of these dense kelp beds along with the lead lines that they dropped over to find the bathymetry. So yeah, I think we'll move along and give, if people want to take a 2 or 3 minute break, go ahead. I'm going to have Alan start right at the 3 o'clock sharp, and we've got a couple minutes. So Sara, thank you so much for that. You've really added a lot to our information, our knowledge here, both today and in general in your work, and I look forward to working with you in the future.